Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be learning how to play the 2 to 5 player game Valparaiso, being released by Stronghold Games in the US. Valparaiso comes with all of the components that you see here, including one double-sided game board, 5 repository boards, 70 coins, 25 market tiles, 75 resource cubes, 1 starting player marker, 24 achievement cards, 1 sand timer, and player components in the 5 different player colors. To begin setup, place the game board in the middle of the table. Make sure and use the correct board for the number of players. Next, each player will take a repository board and choose a player color. The player will take the game materials in that color. It's important to note that in a 2-player game, only 3 merchants will be used. Each player will place their victory point marker on the 0 space of the score track. They will then place one of their merchants in Valparaiso and their ship in the C sector next to Valparaiso. The players will also each receive a set of 8 action cards. Then the players will place their houses on the designated spaces of the player board. One merchant will be placed in the indicated space, and the other merchant is left in front of the players for now. Next, thoroughly mix all of the market tiles, and then place tiles in each of the corresponding spaces based on the letter on their back side. Then take the achievement cards. You may have to remove achievement cards that say 3, 4, or 5 plus, depending on the player count. In our 2-player example, we'll remove any of these cards from the decks. Then separate the cards into different sections based on the letter on the front of the card. Shuffle each stack, then form a face-down deck with the B2 cards on the bottom, the B1 cards on the middle, and the A cards on top. From this face-down draw pile, place the top 9 cards in the slots of the corresponding C sectors at the edge of the game board. Place 5 pesos on each of the outer C sector spaces. Then randomly determine a start player and give them the lighthouse marker. Then, beginning with the last player in player order and then going in a counterclockwise direction, each player will choose 3 goods and place them in their warehouse space. When doing this, no player is allowed to take a combination that's already been chosen. Each combination must be unique. It's important to note that a player's warehouse can hold any number of goods, but a player's cargo hold is limited to 6 goods. And a special action is required to transfer goods from one space to the other. Each player is then given 20 pesos. Money always has to be kept visible to all other players. The remaining goods and money can be placed next to the game board as a general supply. Finally, beginning with the last player, and then going in counterclockwise direction, each player places one of their merchants in a village of their choice. Each player places one of their merchants in an unoccupied village of their choice. After the players have done this, you're ready to play the game. A game of Valparaiso proceeds over several rounds until the end of the game is triggered. Each round will consist of the following 3 phases: the planning phase, using cards, and ending the round. During the planning phase, players will select from all of their action cards and any achievement cards they may have gained, and then the player will lay these cards out face down below their repository board. It's important to note that the cards that are laid down need to be placed in the order in which you plan to use them. Card slots 1 through 4 are always available. Slot number 5 can only be used if you've built 2 of your houses. We'll look at how to do this in a moment. The mayor's slot to the left of your repository board can always be used if you pay 5 pesos. During the planning phase, any player who wants to use the mayor's slot puts 5 pesos on the card, showing that they plan to fill that spot. Once everyone has finished their planning, all cards are revealed without changing their order. Any pesos used to pay for the mayor's cards are put back into the supply. Then the card utilization phase can begin. Then players will move into the using cards phase. During the using cards phase, players will take turns one after the other. Beginning with the start player, each player will use 1 card to carry out an action. Then the next player will carry out an action, and this will go around the table. Normally, a player would use their cards in the order in which they've been laid out. So for instance, this player would typically use this card on their first turn, then their next turn they would use this card, then on their next turn they would use this card, and so forth. It's important to note, however, that a player can use the card that's in the mayor's slot at any time as well. So for instance, instead of using this card as their first turn, a player could use this card. It may be important to use different cards in a different order depending on what other players do. It's also important to note that a player can use any of their laid out cards if they wish. They simply have to pay the cost above a card to use it out of sequence. So for instance, as their first action, this player, if they wanted to, could pay 3 pesos and use this action instead of their planned first action. Once a card is used, it's removed from the player's player board and placed back in their supply of action cards. Then all of the remaining cards are shifted down to take the spot to their left. And once again, a player can always use the card in their mayor slot or the card in their first slot without paying any additional coins. It's also important to note that at any time in the game, a player can give up as many of their own goods as they wish from their warehouse or the cargo hold of their ship and receive 3 pesos for each good. It's also important to note that each action card shows an alternative action on the bottom of the card in addition to the action listed on the top of the card. If players want to, they can always use the bottom alternative action instead of the main action on the top of the card. If players do this, any goods they gain are put in their warehouse and any money they gain is put in their personal supply. So for instance, if this player used this card for its alternative action, they would gain a white and a gray good and place it in their warehouse. Now that we've looked at how players will use their cards during the using cards phase, let's look at the action of each individual card and what it will do for players. The first action to consider is the build a house action. To build a house, a player has to pay 10 pesos. Players are then allowed to build one house at a location where they have at least one of their merchants. So for instance, this player could build a house right here. It's important to note that if a player covers something because of a house being built, they will gain a bonus for that immediately. For instance, this player would gain 1 point when building a house at this location. If a player builds a house in Valparaiso, they will cover the first unoccupied building space starting from the lighthouse. Houses in Valparaiso will give you revenue at the end of each round. So for instance, for having this house here, this player would receive 3 coins at the end of every round. A house that's built in a village without a market will no longer count as a step when they move through this location. We'll look at movement in a moment. Every time another player's merchant moves onto or across this space, they have to pay this player 2 pesos. A house in a village that does have a market counts as an additional merchant for you in this village from now on. To trade with a market, a player still has to have a merchant in the village, but this will count as an additional merchant if you are trading. And a player's trading station will always count as an opposing merchant for other players trading in that location, which basically means they might have to pay you money if they trade here. We'll look at trading in a moment. It's important to note that if a player builds their 4th house, they gain a 1 victory point bonus for doing that. They only gain the bonus once when they build the house. The next action to look at is trading in a village. Players can trade in a village that has a market. Players will know if a village has a market because they will have these tiles. Any village that doesn't have a market will look like this. And it's important to note that players can trade in each village that has at least one merchant of theirs, and the player determines the order in which they trade. So for instance, in this example, the green player could trade in both of these villages. They get to decide which village they would trade in first. A player is allowed to trade as many times as the number of merchants that they have there. So in this example, since this player has 1 merchant and 1 house built in this village, they would be able to trade up to 2 times in this village. And once again, it's important to note that this house does count as an extra merchant when trading, but a player wouldn't be able to trade unless they actually have a merchant in this village. So for instance, if this were the situation, the player would not be able to trade in this village even though they have a house. Players always have to have a merchant to trade in a village. It's also important to note that if there are opposing merchants or trading stations in a village where you want to trade, you have to pay 1 peso to the owner of each of the opposing merchant and opposing trading station. You have to do this whether you trade at this place once or multiple times. So in this example, the green player would have to pay the purple player 1 peso to trade there. In this example, the green player would have to pay the purple player 2 pesos, 1 for the merchant and 1 for the house. When trading in a village, players can only use the trading action of the bottommost market tile. So in this example, a player could gain 7 pesos, up to 3 times, assuming they have 3 merchants and or houses in this location. So in this example, the green player would be able to trade in this location 1 time, and they could only use the action of the bottommost tile. After a trade in a village has been resolved, Immediately move the bottommost market tile of this village to the top of the reserve. Then take the bottommost tile from the reserve and place it at the top of the village, shifting all other tiles down. In general, the market tiles will have actions that work in the same way. Players will either be able to simply gain something shown on the right, or players will have to pay a specific good on the left to gain something on the right. So in this example, this tile would simply allow a player to gain 2 of the orange goods. In this example, a player could pay 5 pesos to gain a point. A player could do this up to 5 times, assuming they have the correct number of merchants and houses in a village. Each time they take the action, they would have to pay 5 pesos to gain 1 point. In this example, a player could simply gain a gray good. In this example, a player would have to pay 10 pesos and a gray good to gain 2 points. And in this example, the player would simply gain a gray and an orange good. I do want to make a few clarifications about trading in a village. First off, it's important to note that if a player takes the trade in a village action and they have a merchant in a village, the bottommost tile is removed from that village regardless of if they actually trade there. So for instance, this player could have removed this tile by trading in the village like we showed, and then decide not to take this action to trade in this village. Even if a player doesn't take an action in a village to trade, the bottommost tile is still removed and replaced by a tile from the reserve. It's also important to note that if a player decides not to trade in a village, they don't have to pay the opposing players in that village. So for instance, this green player could decide not to trade in this village, saving 2 pesos, but they would still have to remove the tile in that village because they have a merchant in the village and they activated the trading action. The next action that we want to look at is hiring a merchant. Let's say, for instance, that the green player, instead of trading with the village, decided to take the alternative action of this card and gain 1 white resource. They would then, on their next turn, have the resources necessary to hire a merchant. To hire a merchant, a player pays 1 good of each type from their warehouse, placing these goods back in the supply, and then they place one of their merchants from their player board in Valparaiso. This merchant is active and can be used immediately. The next action we want to look at is moving a player's ship. This player, for instance, could move their ship by playing this card. When doing this, a player is simply allowed to move their ship to any sea sector for free, 1 or 2 steps away. So for instance, this player could move their ship to this sea sector. And it's important to note that each sea sector can contain any number of ships. The next action to look at is the transfer goods action. If a player's ship is on the sea sector next to Valparaiso, they can transfer any number of goods between their warehouse and their cargo hold. So for instance, this player could transfer these 3 goods to their cargo hold of their ship. It's important to note that if a player fills up their cargo hold completely, they will gain 1 victory point for doing so. This doesn't happen if the cargo hold was already full before the action. The next action to look at is overseas trading. To take an overseas trading action, a player's ship has to be on a sea sector that allows overseas trade. If that's the case, players can acquire 1 of the achievement cards in this sea sector by giving up the 3 required goods indicated on this space. If players are acquiring a level A achievement card from the sea sector, they will additionally gain all the money from that sector. So for instance, the player could acquire this card, placing it into their supply, and then gain these 5 pesos. When a player removes the goods from their cargo hold, they're placed back into the supply. After acquiring the achievement card, it will be placed with the action cards that you didn't choose for planning this round. You can use this achievement card in planning phases from the next round on. The empty space in the sea sector is immediately refilled with the top card of the achievement card deck. If there are no more cards to draw from, the game will end at the end of the current round. If a player wants to gain a B achievement card, but there's still at least 1 level A card lying somewhere, they additionally have to make a compensatory payment of 10 pesos. This money would be put on one of the other 2 sea sectors, the one that has the most level A cards left. If there's a tie between the sea sectors for having the most level A cards, the player would choose either one of those sectors. If there are already 10 pesos on the other 2 sectors, then the money is put into the general supply. The next action to look at is moving a player's merchant. A player can move each of their merchants up to 3 steps. Moving a merchant for the first step is free. A player has to pay 1 peso for each merchant that they want to move 2 steps, and 4 pesos for each merchant that they want to move 3 steps. So for instance, a purple player could move this merchant this first step for free. Then to move them this second step, they would have to pay 1 peso. If the purple player wanted to move their merchant to this space, they would have to pay the green player 2 pesos. This is because the green player has a house in this village without a market. If a player has a house in a village without a market, it's known as a customs house. And each time an opposing player moves through this space, they have to pay this player 2 pesos. If the green player wanted to move, they could move their merchant this first step for free. And if they wanted to, they could move to this next space without paying any money. This is because the customs house has the effect of being a free step for the player who owns the house. The last action to look at is selling a good. To take this action, a player would be able to sell one good of their choice from their warehouse for 10 pesos. The good could be of any color. After all of the players have used all of their planned cards, the round will end. Each player will then receive revenue for all of their residential buildings that they've built in Valparaiso. If a player receives coins, they can simply place them in their personal supply. If a player receives goods, they can place these goods in their warehouse. After receiving residential revenue, the Valparaiso bonus will be paid. The player who has the most residential buildings in Valparaiso receives 5 pesos, and the player with the second most receives 2 pesos. If there's a tie, the player who last built a residential building will prevail. So in this case, the purple player is considered first. Finally, in turn order, and in the order of play, each player will have the opportunity to remove one of their achievement cards from the game and immediately earn the victory points if they want to. So for instance, if this purple player wanted to, they could remove this card and gain 2 victory points. To prepare for the next round, merchants will have to return to Valparaiso. Each player is only allowed to keep one merchant in a village where they don't have any houses. All of the other merchants will have to return to Valparaiso. The player who last built a residential building in Valparaiso will then become the new starting player. And if this player has already been the starting player, or if no house has been built in Valparaiso, the player to the left of the previous starting player becomes the starting player. Then the next round would begin with the planning phase. If a player has at least 18 victory points on the scoring track, the game will end at the end of the round. The game will also end if at least one C-sector slot for the achievement cards is empty and it can't be refilled. In either one of these cases, the final scoring will take place. First, the players will give up all of the goods in their warehouse and their cargo hold and take 3 pesos for each good. Then each player will earn 1 victory point for every 20 pesos they give up. After they do this, make sure to keep the remaining money. After this is done, players will score victory points for any achievement cards they have remaining in their hand. The player who has the most victory points will win. In the case of a tie, the tied player with the most remaining money will win. So in our example, the green player would win with more money. If there's still a tie after counting money, the tied player who went last in the final round will win. Alright everyone, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email us directly at thedicey@gmail.com. If you want to hear more from us, you can listen to the Dicey Review podcast. It can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, pretty much any podcasting app. If you want to read our written reviews, check out thediceyreview.com and make sure and connect with us on Board Game Geek at our Board Game Geek Guild or on our social media accounts. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you at the table.